Once upon a time, specifically after dawn in the year 1750, the young shepherd Alexander Macpherson left his cottage in Glenclwni. Alexander walked through the isolated and deserted areas as if he knew his way, with the wind's strength unceasing, as if enchanted, following a mirage without looking right or left, until he began to approach a place known as Creag Creost. Here, Alexander stopped and began searching the coast and among the moss, until he reached a place covered with moss, and suddenly, as soon as he placed his hand, a human skull appeared. To understand the story, we go back in time 9 months during the uprising, led by Charles Edward Stuart, who attempted to restore the British throne to the Stuart family. His rebellion ended in failure, and he was exiled to France. On April 16, 1745, William, Duke of Cumberland, defeated Stuart's army at Culloden, killing more than 1,500 of Stuart's men. Weeks of the Duke's army chasing Stuart's forces, brutally arresting them and presenting them for trial ensued. Prince Bonny fled to France. At this time, in a farm in the eastern highlands of Scotland, 2 miles from where Alexander lived with the family he served, a garrison of 8 infantry soldiers was established. Another similar garrison was set up 8 miles away. Both places served as stations keeping the countryside under surveillance, gathering weekly to exchange information. One of the stations was under the command of Sergeant Arthur Davies, a man who had recently married the widow of the previous paymaster of the regiment. Although Arthur was supposed to spend 4 months with his wife, he could not spend all of them due to his duty. Despite being disliked among the Highlanders, he managed to earn their respect through his approach to enforcing the law. Arthur was described as a beloved person with kind actions and an enthusiastic athlete who knew no laziness. However, he was hated for the taxes he collected, the bags of money he carried, and the firing for intimidation, which caused resentment and hatred towards him. On September 28, 1749, Sergeant Arthur woke up early to conduct his routine patrol. 1 hour after sunrise, he was in the middle of his mission when he arrived at Glenclwni. He decided to start his favorite sport. He met a group of soldiers who knew he had decided to climb Creag Creost to hunt a deer for dinner. However, the corporal with the soldiers warned him not to go to the hill because it was far from the station and anything could happen to him. But Arthur insisted on having a venison meal for dinner, confident in his self-defense abilities. He separated from his unit and ordered his men to return home. That was the last time they saw him. The next day, the patrol began preparing as usual, waiting for Sergeant Arthur, who was late for the first time. They waited for a while until the corporal decided to launch a search, thinking Arthur was delayed in his hunt the previous night and could not wake up. However, the corporal spent the whole day pondering Arthur's strange absence, which had never happened before. Then he received a message from Arthur's wife informing him that Arthur had not returned from the previous night and asking if he knew his whereabouts. The corporal quickly returned home and informed the wife about the last time he and the soldiers saw Arthur, confirming that something had happened to him on his trip to the hill. He asked Arthur's wife to stay calm and quickly ordered his soldiers to follow Arthur's path from the previous day and trace his steps. Indeed, the place was searched thoroughly across the area, following Arthur's trail, but to no avail. They continued their search all day without finding any indication or evidence of what had happened to him, whether he was alive or dead. Rumors began to spread that Sergeant Arthur had simply run away with the money he had, but his wife was certain that he was robbed and killed on the hill because he was known for carrying a bag full of silver and wearing 2 gold rings on his fingers, along with a silver watch and dozens of silver buttons, which alone would tempt any thief. All his army colleagues agreed that it was impossible for Arthur to have fled because he had a place in the army and was surely going to be promoted soon. His future career was secure. Besides, he was loved by his colleagues and felt love and security with his new wife. From here, all rumors were dismissed, and it was certain that the sergeant was killed by bandits or a group of thieves. The search for Arthur ended completely. His wife lost hope in finding her husband, with whom she hadn't had the chance to live much. She was deeply saddened, especially after discovering her new pregnancy, realizing she had become a widow for the second time. Yet she still harbored a slight hope that Arthur might appear one day, thinking maybe he just got lost or something else happened to him, other than death. Months passed, specifically 9 months, and on one of the summer nights, Arthur's wife began to feel labor pains. She was experiencing severe pain she couldn't bear. Alexander got up to see the officer he saw in his dream, staring at him intensely as if wanting something from him. Alexander quietly approached the officer, who then walked out and Alexander followed. Suddenly, the officer began speaking in Gaelic, the only language spoken by the Highlanders, and started narrating his journey to the hill, confirming that he was killed as everyone suspected. Alexander remembered what he had heard about Sergeant Arthur, who had disappeared on the hill and was said to have either escaped or been killed by highwaymen. He tried to muster his courage to ask the ghost who had killed him, but Sergeant Arthur remained silent throughout the journey, with Alexander following him. Eventually, Alexander reached the place where he found the body, which had mostly decomposed to the point where the skeleton was beginning to show, but Arthur's hair was still at its original length and the shoe was also present. Alexander gathered all his strength to retrieve the body, with Sergeant Arthur standing by and watching. Once Alexander had extracted the entire body, the ghost of Arthur disappeared completely. Alexander returned to his bed, deciding not to tell anyone about this experience, especially since no one would believe him. The next day, Arthur's ghost appeared again to shepherd Alexander, but this time one of his arms was missing. He continued to stare at Alexander without speaking. Alexander asked him what he wanted, and Arthur requested him to go back to the body's location to retrieve his arm and complete the skeleton. Alexander did as asked and returned to his bed. He thought everything was over until Arthur's ghost continued to appear in his dreams and around the cottage, calling him with the same voice. Alexander was distressed and unable to act. Considering it impossible to tell anyone, he decided to take leave from his shepherding job and go back home. After a week, Arthur appeared again to the shepherd, this time completely naked, and asked him to return to the hill and bury his body in a fitting place. Alexander repeated his question about who had killed him, and this time Arthur answered that two men, Clerk and MacDonald, had killed him. After that, Arthur disappeared completely. Alexander decided to share his experience with two of his friends and told them about discovering Sergeant Arthur's body. They advised him not to do anything or secretly bury the body because the perpetrators were two locals, which could provoke the soldiers to retaliate against all the residents, even those who were innocent. Alexander decided to heed their advice and sent for the accused killers to find out the truth. MacDonald and Clerk arrived, and Alexander told them the story. However, both refused to believe his fantastical story, dismissing it as hallucinations. Alexander insisted they come with him to see the body. Indeed, they went to the body's location, which was clearly that of an English officer, as evidenced by the remnants of a blue uniform and shoes, suggesting he was an officer. They decided not to transfer the remains to the local cemetery to avoid detection. Instead, they chose to bury the officer on the spot, despite his request for a fitting burial place. The remains were buried in the ground, and Alexander returned as if nothing had happened. However, within 2 days, news of the discovery of an English officer's body on the hill had spread throughout the area. Particularly because a spirit had named MacDonald and Clerk as the murderers, they became outcasts among the residents, who believed that a returning spirit meant unrest and possibly a curse that could afflict the entire community. This started investigations into the rumors that Donald and Clerk were the murderers of Sergeant Arthur. After the investigations, it was discovered that Clerk had married a village girl with a golden ring, identical to the one belonging to the sergeant. When interrogated, Clerk's wife insisted that the ring was her mother's. Alexander was also interrogated, confessing that Clerk had given him £20 sterling to keep him from reporting the incident. However, Clerk denied all charges. Eventually, Donald and Clerk were arrested and detained in Braemar Castle, then brought to trial with all evidence pointing towards them. Donald and Clerk worked in the forests and were always armed, making it likely they encountered Sergeant Arthur and killed him, coveting his gold rings and silver buttons. The wife confirmed that Clerk was a friend of hers and her husband Arthur, and knew of his habit of carrying money with him. Witnesses confirmed seeing Clerk and MacDonald returning from the direction of the hill early on the day of the sergeant's disappearance. Another witness saw Clerk carrying a knife, only carried by army officers. Alexander told the court the ghost story, which was proven true by his discovery of the body, a location he couldn't have known by any other means. A statement came from a man named Cameron, a Highlander from Rannoch, who confessed he was hiding in a hollow on the hill, fearing authorities suspected him of inciting rebellion. He stayed hidden from the night of September 27th until September 28th, during which he saw 2 local men, one being Clerk. Later, he saw an officer in uniform and heard loud noises, witnessing Clerk assaulting the officer. He fired his rifle but did not see the officer die. Deciding to retreat for his safety, he escaped without being noticed, and later, hearing about Sergeant Arthur's disappearance, he realized the murdered man was indeed Sergeant Arthur, making him a witness to the murder. Ultimately, Clerk was sentenced to death by hanging, and the ghost of Sergeant Arthur was instrumental in uncovering the crime.